Hi, I'm Sarah Weiler from Contemporary Education, an educational services company committed to transforming education to meet the challenges of the 21st century. This presentation is about agency, specifically the concept of agency within the context of education. Part 2 is dedicated to looking at more contemporary thinking about the concept of agency and specifically in education. So starting with the great American progressivist educator John Dewey, he wrote in 1933 about the distinction between routine thinking and action and reflected thinking and action, which I would link back to what I said about the idea of thinking and acting in a mechanical way, in a way that is a product of the incident of your birth and your enculturation. So acting in a way that's reproductive and replicating thoughts and actions rather than thinking about what those thoughts and actions mean and understanding that they're just one possible way of thinking and way of acting amongst many possibilities, and that each one of those possibilities follows from something and has implications and consequences to it. So Dewey says that routine thinking and action is accepted with slight or almost no attempt to state the grounds that support it, whereas reflected thinking and action is deliberately sought, and its adequacy to support the belief is examined through conscious inquiry into the nature, conditions, and bearings of the belief. So it's not just accepting a thought or an action because it seems to be the norm in your context, but rather deliberating upon it, examining it, making it the subject of inquiry, so that then you can really take a position or a stance towards it, and that's an expression of agency. Likewise, the great Brazilian critical pedagogue Paulo Freire, he talked about the problem of traditional education within the metaphor of a banking system. So the teacher is the depositor of thoughts and actions, beliefs that he would characterize as alienating and dogmatic and a kind of an actions that are prescribed. And his response to that problem was praxis. And praxis, I'll paraphrase as a critical, dynamic, transformative, joint action to deconstruct and reconstruct theory and practice dialogically. We can think of praxis as a way to approach the development of students' agency in schools so that they don't simply accept the kinds of conceptual representations and dogmatic prescriptions of how they should think or how they should act, but they look at those as problems to be deconstructed and reconstructed. Dialogue constitutes his concept of praxis when he says, to exist humanly is to name the world, to change it. Once named, the world in its turn reappears to the namers as a problem and requires of them a new naming. Dialogue is the encounter between men mediated by the world in order to name it, involving united reflection and action of the dialoguers to be transformed and humanized. It is conquest of the world for the liberation of humankind. And how important these ideas are in terms of how we understand agency. That agency is about acting critically. It's about making decisions and making choices that are deliberated upon with others from multiple perspectives, and in order to act in a way that is informed, intentional, meaningful, and potentially transformative. Vygotsky, the great Russian educational theorist and author of cultural historical activity theory, focused quite a lot on the question of mediation and how we can use tools as human beings, both material and symbolic or conceptual tools as human beings, to mediate our action within cultural historical activities. And he says the person, using the power of things or stimuli, controls his own behavior through them, grouping them, putting them together, sorting them. In other words, the great uniqueness of the will consists of man having no power over his own behavior other than the power of that things have over his behavior. But man subjects to himself the power of things over behavior, makes them serve his own purposes, and controls that power as he wants. He changes the environment with external activity, and in this way affects his own behavior, subjecting it to his own authority. So again, I've highlighted some sections about using terms like will in relation to free will, and how the power of things, the control over things, to serve our own purposes and subject our own authority. So that using the concept, how you understand a concept as a tool, and how that filters the way that you interpret situations and the way that you apply that concept in action, and how this is essential to this more in-depth idea of agency as not only having the possibility or the opportunity to make a choice or make a decision, but making it with the understanding of what its meaning is, what it follows from, and what follows from it, and then being able to more fully take responsibility for that and be held accountable by others. This next section is a set of contemporary Vygotskian theorists, many of who work in the area of education. And first off is Anne Edwards, a British Vygotskian theorist, and she developed the concept of relational agency. She discusses relational agency as the capacity to align one's thoughts and actions with those of others, to interpret aspects of one's world, and to act on and respond to those interpretations. In cultural historical activity theory, chat terms, it is a capacity to work with others to expand the object that one is working on by bringing to bear the sense meaning of others and to draw on the resources they offer when responding to that sense meaning. She further goes on to say, we transform the world through our actions upon it, and these actions include the conceptual and material resources we bring to bear when trying to make sense of it. If action on the object can be joint action, then arguably a wider range of concepts or other resources are brought to bear on the problem space that is the object. Her work is within the context of schools where, let's say, a student is facing some different challenges, and the school would work in a kind of network way, such that different professionals like the guidance counselor, a social worker, the teacher, the head administrator, and others would come together to try to work on the problem that the child faces and how to support the child and the family in facing that problem and resolving it, so that each one would bring their expertise, their knowledge resources, and also material resources that they have. And then that would become like almost a collective resource or a collaborative resource. By sharing these resources, everyone can draw upon them. And that's what she is talking about. From that context, she's talking about relational agency. Now moving on to Davidov and Engström. Davidov writes that agency is the ability to construct and transform independently one's own life activity. Again, within this Vygotskian idea of cultural historical activity, where we use tools, conceptual and material tools, to act in the direction of our objects or a problem space that we're trying to solve or a need that needs to be met. And Engström talks about agency as intentional, collective, and individual actions aimed at transforming activity. So the strong link with transformation to the concept of agency. Going further into Engström and also his work with others such as Cernino and Lemos, he discusses agency as transformative agency, which he characterizes as a quality of expansive learning. And for him, expansive learning is learning within and between activities in society at large, beyond the confines of school, in which learners join their forces to literally create something novel, essentially learning something that does not yet exist, through the multi-directional movement of learners constructing and implementing a new, wider, and more complex object for their activity. This is done with the help of mediating means employed and built throughout the design process. And I'm adding, just from the general context of his work, that this is often in response to contradictions, dilemmas, and conflicts within cultural historical activities. He further discusses that learning expansively requires breaking away from the given frame of action and taking initiative to transform it. The new concepts and practices generated is an expansive learning process that carries future-oriented visions loaded with initiative and commitment by the learners. So again, transformative agency, looking at the activity, looking at its historical origins and trajectory over time, the activity across different cultures, and then what are the contradictions, the dilemmas, the conflicts within this activity, and thinking about how to use material and conceptual resources in order to further innovate and transform the activity and create something new. Liberali is a Brazilian Vygotskian. She's an applied linguist but works primarily within the area of education. And she cites Engström and Cernino and Virkkunen, saying that agency is related to intentions and willful actions, and it can be understood as the rupture of pre-established patterns of action in subjects' roles, taking initiatives to transform them. So similar to what Engström said of breaking away from the given frame of action and taking initiative, Liberali uses the term rupture of pre-established patterns of action and the initiative to transform them. She also cites Engström in saying that agency centrally refers to the development of authority and authorship of each individual over their own lives. Ninin and Magalhães work with Liberali in Brazil in an educational context with a strong focus on applied linguistics. And Ninin and Magalhães talk about agency as displayed by criticism and resistance in its initial stage, progressing to the individual's commitment not only to the other with whom they interact, but also to themselves and the context in a collective perspective, aiming at transformation. Critically collaboratively characterized, this type of action by the subject is supported by attitudes of responsiveness, alterity, deliberation, mutuality, weighing, and interdependence, all of which are carried out by and in the discourse, taking into account the enunciative, linguistic, and discursive spheres. Agency involves a theoretical and methodological framework in which individual and collective learning and development are embedded in a social and historical context permeated by tensions and conflicts, mainly triggered by contradictions arising from the clash between traditional theories and practices and new possibilities brought to the discussion. So once again, there's this focus on transformation, but in this very dynamic process that builds upon what's already existing and innovating and transforming it into new iterations of what it could be. But this is done very importantly for Ninin and Magalhães from a critically collaborative standpoint, so that it's relying on multiple perspectives from others and taking a critical position towards those perspectives that is responsive and that tries to, in terms of alterity, put oneself in the other one's shoes to understand where they're coming from, and deliberation and weighing of ideas. So this is all something very important to take into consideration in terms of agentive decision making. And finally, drawing upon the Finnish author Rajala, who discusses epistemic agency and conceptual agency, citing many other authors that you can see here, defining epistemic agency as a metacognitive ability that reflects a shift in the responsibility for setting learning goals from the teacher to students. And it involves students taking increasing responsibility not only for their individual contributions to knowledge in the classroom, but also for the overall progress of knowledge building. Conceptual agency, on the other hand, entails actions depending on students' choices of the types of material or conceptual resources to be appropriated, adapted, or modified for a specific purpose in the learning activity. Conceptual agency emphasizes that student authority is counterbalanced by the accountability to others and disciplinary norms. So, having all of these different viewpoints on agency, hopefully it's something that can empower you as an educator to think how to plan your lesson centrally focused on the development of your students' agency.